going.
So
The topic today is grief, death, and afterlife. And I think when we talked about this before, we talked a little bit about the rituals that we have, starting there, the rituals that we have around death and grief. Do you want to just share a little bit? Can you help me with a little bit of what is done from a Jewish perspective?
Sure. Yeah, starting with the rituals, I feel like the rituals in many ways express the deeper theology that we'll get to. So it's a nice introduction. On one's deathbed, I guess we'll start there. There's confessional, and there's also a reciting of the Shema, which is like the central prayer of faith that God is one, everything is one. And then after the person dies, there's a lot of rituals for respect to the body, human beings being created in the image of God, and we're not supposed to, it doesn't really belong to us. So we have to make sure that the body is cared for. So there's no cremation, there's no putting of chemicals into the body, even autopsy only if necessary. And the body is guarded, most traditionally guarded by somebody who sang psalms, even if they have to sit outside of the refrigerator. The body is washed by a crew of volunteers. It's called Torat. It's cleansed with mikvah waters, dipped into ritual bath, and dressed like the high priest, the Kohen Gadol, on Yom Kippur, with this white linen shroud and often wrapped in their talit. And the family at the funeral, they tear their clothing because their soul is, something's been torn inside of them. And the burial is, in a very simple coffin, wooden box, holes in it. It's really supposed to go right back to the earth. We're just not actively destroying the body, but the body needs to go back to the earth as naturally, and the soul returns to its source. And then the family is in the mourning period, Shiva, 7 days, although often people, sometimes they don't do all 7 nowadays. It's hard to get away from work for that or whatever life. But really the purpose of Shiva is that you stay home and you're not looking in the mirror, you're not buying new clothes, shaving, you're not going to parties with music and dancing. People are visiting you, bringing you food and comforting you. And ultimately, you're observing these days of Shiva and saying Kaddish, a special prayer to sanctify God's name in the world, and giving tzedakah, giving charity on their behalf, the person who died. You light a candle, a 7-day candle that represents the person's soul, is a candle of God. And the purpose of all of these a lot of the rituals, is not just for the mourner so much, but it's actually to comfort the soul of the person who died. There's something called chibut hakever, where after a person dies, the first few days especially, that there is pain and anguish of having, they're trying to hold on to their body and this world and life, and the separation is very painful. And so we do these rituals to comfort the person who's mourning and help them in the process of separating and ascending, because the essence of who they are is their soul. Okay. Of course, now that's a lot of different ideas and stuff and traditions, but ultimately I'll put it out there. We don't really, I'm saying this like I know what happens, but of course nobody really knows. So right. That's a given. Okay. Sorry, go ahead.
No, yeah, I think that's always really important to remind ourselves of. Anytime we do anything theological, we have to approach it with a lot of humility, because really we don't know what we're talking about, which is, so theology is the best profession to go into, because you start with, I don't know what I'm talking about, and then you can say anything, and then, fix it with but I don't know what I'm talking about. What do I know? It's really, I'm really interested in this approach of the body, and I'll kind of give you the context of where we come from, and so why that interests me. And from our perspective, especially as Baptists, we have separated ourselves so much from ritual. And part of that is because in the Roman Catholic tradition, who are also Christians, Roman Catholics and Baptists they're both Christians. are all Christians. Want to make sure that's clear. There's a lot more ritual involved in the service, and you would find this also with the Episcopalians. They'll have sprinkling of holy water on the casket. They'll have a big cloth they'll put over the casket. There's this idea that there's a special dirt you put on top of the body, at the casket as it's being lowered. Baptists and really a lot of Protestants have distanced themselves from that because part of our history is making sure everyone gets that we are not Catholic, and that has its own bunch of baggage. And I can get into that if you'd like, but I'm not going to right now. But part of what comes out of that is the respect, the treatment around the body that I heard from you, Aaron, we don't have. There's embalming, which is, they get rid of the fluids and put in other fluids to keep the body preserved for a certain amount of time to make it look as good as possible for the funeral service. If you're going to have an open casket, which there's not a rule if you have open or closed, it depends on churches and really upon the family. I think cremation is becoming more and more prevalent. And that's more services that I do are the cremains. That's become an accepted practice. The idea of watching the body, none of that is really a part of our tradition. So the understanding of the body is really fascinating. I think where we come from is this idea that as soon as someone dies, then their soul or their spirit, and we can try to parse out those words, is immediately gone. It's immediately with God. There isn't this mediation time. Now, there might be some who would say, maybe some people are still clinging. But overall, when the person dies, when they breathe their last, they are now with God. And so the body is just a husk. Mm-hmm. And we even have this, we have the scripture in 1 Corinthians 15, where Paul, the Apostle Paul writes, what was sown perishable is now raised imperishable. So this idea that what comes out of the body is now this imperishable new being that has a spirit essence to it. So that's why the whole treatment, the approach that you have towards the body, I find just really, really fascinating. I don't know if I don't have a question or if that sparked anything, just even that sharing that contrast.
Is there a connection? I mean, in some ways, Judaism's approach to the body, it's not that there is a distinction, the soul and the body, but that the body is the means by which we can do mitzvot, do godly works. And so it becomes raised up to a very high level in one's life. And so it has a sanctity unto itself. And then also just being in the image of God. But I wonder if, I don't know. I mean, some of the stuff about open casket and viewing the body, which we don't do in Judaism, is that also to some extent to honor the person who died? I mean, I could think like from a outside perspective, I'm looking in and I can say, you know what, maybe there's different ways to honor the person who died. And this is just a different way of doing that,
I think it's a both and. I think it's partially to honor it. And it's also in large part an opportunity for the family to say goodbye. So already you may say, well, but you said the spirit's already gone. The body is just a husk. But for those who are, for their loved ones, to have that last chance to at least look at the body and to embrace the memory of who that person is, that can be really significant. And oftentimes when we have funerals, this is more a funeral home, where the casket is there. After we do the service, before we go to the graveside, they'll ask everyone to leave and the family will stay for that one last look at the body. And there is that significant aspect. Part of a funeral service for us is just saying goodbye and grieving and saying this hurts. But it's also expression of gratitude to God for the life that person lived, to say who this person was a blessing to us. Or it may be to add, and also it's not, or it's also, yes, and asking for God's help. And it may be that if there was a brokenness in the relationship, if you said this person was a father, but not the father I was always hoping for, to ask God, like, would you come into this part of the grief is messed up with a brokenness in the relationship, and I need your help because there's reconciliation can't happen in the way I want it. So all these things are happening in our funeral service. We don't have the ritualized aspect of it, though, in that same way.
Is there anything comparable that you know of in Catholicism? I'm just curious, or I mean,
I know that in Catholicism they would have extreme unction, and that is before the person dies. I think it's called extreme unction, which is the final anointing. Before the person dies, they would ask a priest to go, and the individual who's dying, so on their deathbed, would make a confession, and the priest would absolve them of all sins. As Baptists, we don't practice that. We don't have the idea that I can absolve sins. I've been with people on their deathbed, and I've prayed with them, but it's between them and Jesus.
Jesus and God absolve sin, not you. You're not a priest, you're a pastor in a sense, right?
That's a good way to put it. Yeah.
I think that's also more similar to our role as rabbis. Like, we did have priests in ancient Israel, and there are still people who are Kohanim and who descend from that, but the rabbi is supposed to be equally on the same level, although obviously more knowledgeable maybe, or something like that. But yeah, definitely. And a lot of the stuff you just talked about with the healing is definitely something I've experienced in the family relationships, and how the funeral service and the experience of the mourning and grief being held, though, in community and tradition is really a huge part of what's happening there. It's not, like you said, it's not just saying goodbye to that person, but helping the people on earth find their peace with everything. And,
in the Shiva time, in the time when you're sitting Shiva, is that a real time when family can work through some of the complications of grief, or just the actual grief itself? Are they encouraged? Do you work with them sometimes with that?
Yeah, absolutely. People are usually gathered with their family, and, they're being reminded, because they're with their whole family, or, a good portion of their family and friends, they keep being reminded of the fact that, like, who's missing, and like at a meal together, all of that. And it kind of, it helps the person in a short period of time. Not short, I mean, it keeps going. There's the 30 days, and then there's the 11 months, which I'll mention, but really that it helps. I think it helps the person process what has happened and bring it into a sense of reality. And then also with the candle and the saying the Kaddish, even though you're saying goodbye to that person and there's their body in this world, but you're also finding ways to stay connected to them, through these rituals, through doing charity tzedakah on their behalf, and conjuring up their memory. Like at the service, we'll have a chance for people to share little stories and stuff like that. There's a lot of rules about how you approach the mourner, because you want to not, it's all about them. It's not a cocktail party where they have to entertain, but yeah, in practice, it often can be tiring for the mourners too. So I'll say that people who do the full Shiva sometimes feel like by the end of it, they're like, you know what? Oh, I'm so glad to get back to my routine a little bit. So there's some positive to that as well. At the end of Shiva, they are supposed to take a walk around the block with their family to kind of say, I'm going back out into the world. But then there's stuff that continues depending on how you're related to the person who died. I'm curious about the soul, though. I want to know more about, people ask me this all the time, or especially at funerals or when they have loved ones that are dying. Where is grandma, or where is my wife or husband? What happens to the soul? And of course, I'm always kind of like, well, we don't have any scientific reports, so I can't tell you that this is exactly what happens, but I can tell you what our tradition has collected over the years in terms of wisdom and a sense of what is happening. Do you want to talk about it first, or? Should
Yeah,
I
I
go
guess
first or whatever?
I can go first this time. It's
All
only
right,
fair,
great.
right? Yeah.
Take turns. Very good.
I mean, it's so, I think within Christianity, the idea of the soul has been a prevalent part of the way we talk about it, like what happens next. And this idea of our soul then goes up to heaven. And we even say up to heaven because heaven clearly is above us, which is not necessarily the case. It's, when we launched satellites into space, we found out, nope, or we just need to keep going up. We haven't gone high enough. But there certainly is this idea that that the person is with God. Now, I'm a little weary of the terminology of talking about the soul, and only because in our history that's created this dualism of there's the body and there's the soul, and I'm weary of that because it can create this sense of like I don't have to worry about this body, and that has happened in Christianity where people just don't take care of themselves. And they'll say, what do I care? This is just flesh. It's just temporary. When I'm with God, then I'll be in a better state of mind. And that's just not healthy. But also the way we then, it impacts our relationship with creation. If we say this creation itself is just, it's only for a time, it's temporary. So we don't have to take care of it because we're all going to go and be with God in heaven. And that's going to be the better place we're looking forward to. That now everyone who talks about the soul ends up in that place. I always, part of what I try to do is say, what are the implications of our speech? So I just say, you are with God. We are with God in a different kind of way. But the idea of, if we talk to any other Christian, they'll say, yeah, the soul is a real thing. So that is, I would say that is what salvation is. And when we talk about like afterlife, is being with God and being with God in a full, authentic kind of way, that here on earth there's always going to be this separation, this limitation, because we are humans. As we talked about last week, we mess up, we err, we sin. We're gonna do it no matter how hard we try, and that's going to get in the way of our relationship with God. But after we die, then we're in a place where we are living fully into the perfection of what God desires, and we're fully in the presence of God in a way that is bliss. And then I would say, and with all those who've gone before us as well. So, is heaven surrounded by people? Sure, yeah, because God gathers all of those into God's presence, and it's oftentimes with others that we experience God fully. So then to be with our parents who've gone before us, or our siblings, or our spouses, in a way that doesn't have all of those limitations that get in the way of our relationship, but to be in that full kind of relationship, the divine is fully known there as well. So that's kind of how I think about like afterlife, of what heaven is.
Is there, what's the role of the Messiah in this process?
Assurance. It's an assurance. And because, one of the things I think we wrestle with is, do we know if we're good enough? Am I good enough? And there could be a worry, like, what if I stepped on too many bugs right before I died? And God will look at that and say, boy, you really murdered a lot of bugs. And as much as you may not like those insects, they're still my creatures. And so, no, you can't be here. I mean, that's kind of silly, but sometimes the absurd helps bring out that point. But what we would say is the Messiah, we understand is Jesus Christ, that by him dying on the cross and then rising again, we find this assurance that nothing will separate us from the love of God. Even so much as us fully rejecting God, which is part of how you can view the cross, that humanity rejects and kills God. The fact that Christ comes back, is resurrected, and comes back and continues to preach love and forgiveness, and not vengeance and punishment, says that God's love transcends all sin. So that assurance.
That's beautiful.
Yeah, and we can then parse like, how do you gain that and such, and that's for different kind of Christians. But I'll stop right there because I want to hear about your understanding of what happens next, or of the soul.
Well, so, I mean, certainly Christianity and Judaism come from the same river. So I feel like there definitely are some similarities there. I don't know how it is in baptism, but I know that in some faith traditions, you have to believe something specific, and if you don't, you're kind of in or out. And Judaism, we do have beliefs that are core beliefs, but none of them really, except for maybe the acknowledgement or existence or pursuit of knowledge of God, but none of them are really going to say you're not Jewish anymore. And ultimately, when you are doing mitzvot, it's all about, the main focus is what we're doing in this world. The Talmud warns us it's better not to think too much about what's above, what's below, what was before, what comes after, because if you did, you might as well not have been born. You might as well have just stayed in heaven or whatever. And they witnessed people, there's stories in the Talmud of people who didn't have the preparation and the grounding in the world, and they went crazy, or they became heretics, or they died, or things like that. So this kind of stuff is something that we don't talk about a ton, partially I think, or mainly for those reasons, because Judaism's very focused on this world and less on the afterlife, and which is pretty amazing, because in the ancient world, so many of the religions were focused on the afterlife, the temples and the pyramids and everything. So in the time of the Torah, the Sheol is mentioned, which is some kind of underworld. It doesn't seem to have any hierarchy, and I think we've talked about this before. It's common to both that we have this in the Torah, in the Bible. But in the time of the prophets and Daniel, they start talking about how this is a temporary stopping point on the way to the Garden of Eden, or the world to come, or resurrection. And then in the rabbinic writings, or in the oral tradition, which some of them are definitely older than the rabbinic period, there's a lot of teachings about the world to come, Olam Haba. Although the vast majority of the oral Torah is about this world and what we're supposed to be doing, almost to an obsession. But anyway, this idea that God is the ultimate living being, Elohim Chaim, is connected to this idea that that there's a part of the soul that is God. It's like a part of God. And so the soul is eternally alive. And so when the body dissipates, the living part of us continues. Let's see, this world is kind of like a lobby or a waiting room where we're preparing ourselves for the world to come, even though, like I just said, it's not, the focus is still on the lobby and how you're preparing yourself. So the first thing, I mean, I'm just trying to compile all of the ideas into one short story of the soul. But the silver cord is cut, the person's soul begins to leave their body, which we say that the soul cries twice, right? When it leaves heaven and enters a body, and then it, doesn't want to leave heaven, and then when it leaves this world, it's also, there's some pain in we're connected to this world and the materialism and our body in such a strong way, and those who are more connected to it in a superficial way, it'll be harder for them to ascend. The soul then gets taken by a slingshot, where, like a sling, those ones with the rock in it, and one angel on one side of the universe throws the soul across the universe, and another angel catches it, and then they throw it back to the other angel, and they do this, it's called kafakela. They do this for a while until all of the road dust from, like you said, there's, when you do things in your life that are wound you or others in ways, and then you get a dip in the river of light, which is made from the sweat of the angels praising God, and you float in this river, and it washes away all of the dust and the stuff that was shaken loose from the cosmic sling, and it kind of restores your soul to a radiance. They also say that your loved ones accompany you there at that time as you're in the river of light, floating. And then there's this idea of Gehinom. So we don't really have hell, like eternal damnation, although maybe you could say there's some examples where it sounds like that's what they're saying. But ultimately, Gehinom is a valley. It's an actual valley in Jerusalem that used to be a garbage dump. And it was a place where people would burn their garbage and poor people would pick through it. And it was the smelliest, most hellish place people could imagine. Also, there were the people of Molech used to, before it was a garbage dump, they used to sacrifice children there. I don't know. So anyway, that's the name that we give Gehinnom, the Valley of Hinnom, to what we might call hell, but is really more of a purgatory. And the idea is that the soul is meant to work together with the body, but ultimately it gathers up this negative stuff. And so when you're in Gehinnom, you're not physically being burned. The soul can't experience fire in that way, but there's a sense of shame when you see you're given a review of your, defending your life. You're given like a review of your life, and you feel some shame. This whole process is only meant to take no more than 12 months. But if someone's like the most wicked person, so it's temporary. But this place, heaven, eventually the stench of the bad deeds, the fresh air of heaven kind of dissolves and dissipates it eventually. And then you get a second dip in the river of light, and then you're ready to enter the Pardes, the orchard or the Garden of Eden, to do more of God's work. One of the things is the righteous are there to intercede on behalf of us in our life. And that if they weren't praying for us and interceding, then the world would not stand. And they're also illuminated by the light of divine presence and serving in the temple above, which is not, which the temple below was a mirror of in Jerusalem. And then each year the soul reaches a higher level. So at the yard site, at the anniversary, I'm sorry, I'm going to stop soon. I'm rambling. There's a lot of information. At the anniversary of their death, we light a candle, a 24-hour candle to remember the loved one. And we say Kaddish for them. It's a special prayer. And there's also Yizkor, prayer we say at different holidays for the deceased. And we give tzedakah, charity. And in doing so, we're helping them to keep ascending, because there's really no ceiling. Because once you hit the ceiling, there's there's another floor, and then ultimately the highest level is B'tzura Chayim, to be in the bonds of life, which is, basically united with God. There are people also who are, I guess, especially after the mystical, the Arizal of the 16th century popularized it, and now it's more common in Judaism, a little less known, is reincarnation. The idea that Gilgul Nefashot, Gal is the word for wave. Gilgul is kind of a double wave, but basically it's a cycling over, a cycle, and that the soul is, it doesn't complete it has to complete its spiritual body, the growth of its spiritual body through acts, through mitzvot, in its life, and it doesn't complete it in one lifetime, and so it comes back to do unfinished work, mitzvot that it didn't get to do in its previous life, and then eventually, and this can happen multiple times, and it's not like you get born as like a fish or a dog if you were bad or something, but you're not being brought there to be punished or rewarded, but really to do this work in God's world that God still needs you to do, and on your soul that God still needs you to do. And the idea then is ultimately the spiritual body becomes complete and you achieve this unity with God and with other people that you knew before.
Wow. So we have about a minute left.
Oh my God, I'm sorry.
That's all right. I mean, that imagery is absolutely beautiful. And I think you would find in Catholicism or and especially in medieval Christianity, similar layers of that imagery. Of course, Dante's Divine Comedy is lifted up, and Dante's Divine Comedy is beautiful poetry and it's powerful writing. It's not a literal description of what happened. It's his
right. He didn't actually go there and then come back and report.
Right. Yeah. Sorry, that's the big spoiler is he didn't really walk with Virgil and then Beatrice. But I think now, like I said, for many reasons, in part because Baptists and other Protestants have tried to distance themselves from Roman Catholicism, we've let go of a lot of that kind of imagery, and yet at the same time, I think we've tended to, maybe more in the past, overemphasize what happens next over what are we doing now. So they would say, what matters most is that if you die, you're going to go to heaven. And we've even, we tried to scare kids into saying, you better accept Jesus as your savior because you could die tomorrow. And do you know where you're going to go? It's that kind of thing. And much more imagery has been painted around what hell would look like.
I can tell that that's
heaven.
Not the main focus of your work.
No, I found that trying to scare people into belief, it does not usually work. Well, we are at time, and I know, Aaron, you and I could probably keep talking about this, but we have so many people here who I imagine have questions. So I think what might be best is you could either, write your questions in the chat, and Aaron or I will just go ahead and read it if you're not comfortable speaking, or if you just kind of you could wave your hand digitally. There's a way to do that if you know how to, and we'll look for that. Or you could just gesticulate wildly, and we'll be going back and forth. And what we'll have to do is call on you. We'll unmute you. We'll ask you to unmute. You will have to hit the unmute and then go ahead and ask. Sorry, there's a lot of steps there, but hopefully this will go fine. So what kind of questions? Let me set the timer again so we're not here forever, because I know we could be. What do you have for questions?
Was there anything in the chat already?
Oh, no, I see.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
I don't want to. Well, my dad actually wants to ask a question, so out of respect.
Thanks, Aaron.
Let's have your dad ask a question.
Thanks. What I'm curious about is you both describe, your individual religions and how they approach it. Is there ever any discussion within the rabbinics or the Talmud or whatever, and your background, Pastor, that people from the different religious backgrounds actually meet? In other words, we all die. We have our own beliefs as to where we go. But can we only meet up with Jews, or can Baptists only meet up with Baptists? What do you think about that?
Well, first of all, I hope that it's not just Baptists in heaven that have to hang out with other Baptists, because that would get boring fast. Jim, I see your question. I'll come to you next when we're finished. I think I'll speak from my perspective. I'm weary to talk about the places where we come together, because anytime you have interfaith conversation, talking about similarities runs the risk of watering down everything. And this has been a challenge. This is a good challenge. It's a good problem for us to have, is how do we engage in interfaith in a way that respects our differences, that respects where that we come from rich traditions, without watering them down.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but
no, go ahead.
I think if I'm hearing his question correctly, it's not just where do we meet in terms of our beliefs, but do we actually meet in heaven? Like, are Jews permitted? Right. Would Jews be permitted into the same places, or at least close to the places where Christians would be?
That's good. Thank you for helping me focus. Do you want to answer that first, then, and I can give an answer? I'll just give my answer.
Sure. In Jewish tradition, we're such a minority, such a small tradition, and it's family passed on through family, not proselytizing. So really, we've always believed that anybody who's righteous is permitted to the world to come or to the Garden of Eden, and that everybody has work to do, spiritual work. The Jews have specific instructions, specific work. And in fact, I've even told non-Jews, don't convert. I mean, unless you really don't do it for, your mother-in-law or whatever, unless you really are ready to commit to doing these things, because you'll make it even harder on yourself. But anyway, Christians and Jews, they should be able to be in the same place. Although I'm sure if you were to ask very traditional Jews from a Hasidic background who were influenced by living in the old country where they were constantly oppressed by non-Jews, that they might have some things to say about, the Jews have preference, or Jews have a special level of their soul that's even more holy. But there's definitely nothing about saying that non-Jews can't be admitted into the God's place.
Yeah, and I think from a Christian perspective, it's very much a live debate, and I know there are a significant portion of Christians who would disagree with me and say there's only one way to heaven, and that's through accepting Jesus Christ as Lord and Savior. But I would say there's an assurance in that. But I also believe that God is love and God is loving. And why would a loving God then say, no matter how good you are, you're going to be condemned to hell? So if you are a good person with love on your heart, God sees that, God knows that, God welcomes you into God's arms. And so yes, we will all, I would say we will all be there. Jim Hopkins.
Thank you. I'm glad you got into this piece of the conversation about who ends up being accepted into the world, God's world. So I'm curious about what happens to the non-believer, the people that have said, I don't want anything to do with this, but they still lead good lives.
You want me to go first, Aaron? Or
yeah, sure. You go first.
Okay, so this is where I really like Dante's Divine Comedy. He has a real, so yeah, if nothing else, if after this session you then are inspired to read all 3 volumes of the Divine Comedy, I feel like I've done good work. It's long. Just let me warn you, it's long and a bit tedious.
It's a comedy though. It's funny, right?
Yeah.
So
I've heard 2 things. Yeah. Well, there's a real existentialist quality to the Divine Comedy. People, especially in the Inferno part, the hell part, people choose to be there. And I really embrace that idea that you choose, what you choose is what you choose. And so if you live a good life and you say, but I'm not going to believe in God and I don't want there to be a God, and when I die, I want that to be it, then most likely that'll be it. It's not a condemnation that you're now going to be in heaven, in hell, and you're going to be tormented. It's just you're not with God. And that might, I'm sure I could be pushed on this again. This is a place where I don't know. But if people desire to be with God, or then they'll, and they live a good life and do their best, they'll be with God. Again, I find an assurance in my own faith through Christ that this is, a certainty. But for those who say, I don't believe in God, I'm going to live a good life, but I don't want to be in heaven, then okay, that's what you get. I as a person of faith, I grieve for that decision. I feel like there's so much more that can be found in living a life with faith and the idea that there's more after. But I don't think there's a condemnation either. Aaron?
Yeah, as I was saying before, there isn't, Judaism's focus is very much on your actions in the world and less on the beliefs, although the beliefs are really important, but they don't kind of keep you from having a future, sort of your soul having a relationship with God at all. I think that, if someone is a really wicked person and they don't believe in God and they're also really wicked, then it would take them a full 12 months to go through the process of separating from the body and experiencing that shame. But ultimately, God needs all of the souls that are created for a purpose and doesn't forsake them ultimately. And that when someone is, I suppose if someone were to publicly do something to spite God, like not just do something because their desire took them over or something, but if they were really trying to spite God in some way in people's eyes publicly, then that's considered to be, but ultimately the belief part is less essential than the action.
And so then, regardless of their belief, if they live a decent life, then they can be with God, even if they were an atheist their whole life.
Yeah, there's a ton of Jewish atheists. There's a ton of Jewish agnostics. I would say probably a majority of American Jews are agnostic. I don't know if that's true, but I feel like it might be. But it doesn't mean that they're not passionate. And ultimately, when you talk to them, they do have a spirituality in a sense often of connection to something greater, but they just don't call it God, or they don't want to put a male king father name on it,
Right.
you know.
Yeah, that sounds wonderful. Other questions? Nancy?
This is more for you, Pastor.
Okay.
I am Jewish. I'm part of the member of the temple. And I have a friend, and comes from a Catholic perspective, who is Catholic. And she is always telling me, my parents have died, that she prays for them. And then you also hear about the Mormons who pray for the Jews who died in the Holocaust. And I've always wondered, what does that exactly mean? What are they praying for? I just don't understand the concept.
Sure. So in Catholicism, there's a more articulated understanding of purgatory, and then also limbo and hell. They've recently, I think, did away with limbo. Limbo was a place where if infants died before they had an opportunity to be baptized, they wouldn't be able to get to heaven, but they shouldn't be condemned. So they're just put in a limbo. And then I think in the last 5 years or so, the Vatican said, it's probably not a great idea. Let's just put them all in heaven. I'm kind of, I mean, that's an unfair, just, you know.
But he can do that, right? Can the Pope do that though? Like he has the ability to.
What I think what they say is probably there is this idea of doctrine evolving, but the idea of praying for someone who has died, I think, comes out of this idea that they're probably in purgatory, which means they were good, but they weren't Christian, so they'll never be able to fully get to heaven. And purgatory is kind of this like, well, you weren't evil, so you shouldn't be punished, but you didn't, go all the way. This is from their perspective as a Christian. So you're not going to get to heaven. So we're going to pray for you that you at least get to the best part of purgatory as you can. And maybe while you're in purgatory, you will get to this place of saying, oh, I see now, I'll accept Jesus Christ. And then make that conversion. And this was, this goes all the way back to the medieval era and earlier. There was a time, this kind of sparked the Reformations with Martin Luther and all that stuff. People would pay indulgences. You would pay for the people that have died, for the priest to say prayers on your family members' behalf. Which, a great moneymaker. If you're looking for ways to raise money for the synagogue or for my folks, we want to do an addition to the church, we can start charging for prayers again. That's how they built the Sistine Chapel. So that's the idea of saying, I'll pray for your parents. And in Mormonism, it is this, they've done, I don't know a lot about Mormonism, but I understand that they can do a retroactive baptism. So they can baptize your family members of the past and to help them get into heaven. So that's probably where they're coming from. I find that problematic because it does. Okay, yeah.
I find it very problematic.
Yeah, I would hear that your friend is probably coming from hopefully let's give them the benefit of the doubt that it's coming from a good place, a sincere place. Yeah, and I think that's always important. But yeah, it's problematic to say I'm going to pray for your Jewish relatives because they're not going to get to heaven, but hopefully they'll get the best they can out of the afterlife.
Okay.
I don't know, Aaron, if you want to add to that at all or anything like that.
No, I've experienced that too. I think I mentioned that last time, less today, although I do get a lot of stuff in the mail at the synagogue from from priests or people, evangelical, people who are, I'll look at it, I'll think they try to trick you, like, oh, you think it's something else. And then you realize, oh God, okay, all right. And then I don't want to have anything to do with that. I wouldn't mind having a conversation with somebody, but it just gives you a weird feeling when, when people are like, it's sort of patronizing a little bit, but at the same time, I do try to look for the divine point that it comes from, like you said, like, well, they want to do the best thing that they can. And even if it's causing hurt, and, it's like, oh, my relatives who died in the Holocaust, you think they need help being saved? Do you realize what they freaking went through? They've atoned for all the sins, not just of themselves, but all of the people in their family. because of what they went through. So don't tell me, so I get
Right.
a little angry about it. At the same time,
Yeah.
I've gotten used to it. So it becomes sort of like microaggressions a little bit. I don't know if that's the right term for it, but at the same time, and I know that most Christians that I know are not, actively thinking about that,
Right.
when they meet
But
me.
I think I saw, Jim, you have your hand raised. I want to see if anyone else, because you got to ask a question first, so you understand. I want to see if anyone else has one, then we'll get to you. But it does speak to how insidious the seeds of anti-Semitism are. That's something that feels like it's coming from a good place. Those are parts of those roots of, and I'm, speaking as a Christian, trying to own that part of our history with that. Those are parts of those roots that really create anti-Semitism as we see it. So while most Christians may say, well, no, we don't believe that, but got to keep digging and rooting out those places. That's
that means
for the
a lot
Christian.
to me, by the way. Just hearing you say that, like, really, I'm getting like emotional.
Oh.
It really means a lot to me when you say that.
Oh, good. Well, we
It
still have a
feels
lot
like
of work to
something
do.
is healing,
Good. Oh, I'm glad to hear that. I wanted to see if Jim, but does anyone else have a question? Okay, Jim, go ahead.
I would like to go back to that question about praying for the people in the Holocaust. For me, maybe it's me atoning for the fact that Christians didn't do enough to stop this. But I certainly am not thinking that the people who were in the Holocaust were somehow unqualified to go to heaven and they went to purgatory. At least it's not on my mind that way. When I pray, it's about the terrible things that happened to them and some piece of the Christian world that didn't respond and take care of that fast enough.
Wow, thank you.
And I don't know if that's true for everybody, but it's not about some sort of theology other than caring for the circumstance.
It's such a great point, Jim. And the difference, though, is saying instead of me going to, like Aaron is saying, I'm going to pray for your relatives. If you have any that died in the Holocaust, I'm going to pray for them. That's problematic. But instead saying, I'm going to pray for the prison guards. I'm going to pray for those who were, tacitly involved. I'm going to pray for them because, while I do believe in forgiveness, I do believe that God forgives. I think it's an important wondering for us to have, is there still that weight that they carry even in heaven? It doesn't feel right for people to be involved in such atrocities, then to die and say, like, I'm clean, we're good. It doesn't feel right. So
like
I
I believe in
Jim.
Jesus, so I'm all set.
Yeah. And in a very real way, we are still, I would say the same thing with racism in America. We are living with those sins. And so when we pray for those who may have been perpetrators, we're also praying for ourselves, because we continue to live with those wounds. And if we don't start to name them and pray for forgiveness and for repentance in one way or another, we are going to continue to wrestle with them, which ties us back to last week. But yeah, great point, Jim. Other questions?
I have a thought that leads into what we're talking about next week, maybe. You were talking about people dying, and in Judaism, we do have this concept of Kiddush Hashem, that people can die as martyrs. And of course, we see the people in the Holocaust, but throughout thousands of years of Jewish history, all these atrocities that have happened. And so sometimes when I've had somebody who was trying to proselytize and saying, well, Jesus, he died for you to atone for, and I say, well, I've got millions, billions of Jews. That's just one Jewish guy. And yes, he suffered. Like, it was bad. I feel bad about what happened, and he definitely atoned in some way. But like, we've got billions and billions of Jews who died as martyrs. And I don't really feel the need, personally, I don't feel the need for that one Jewish man who ultimately, from your perspective, is God. So I guess I could see how that would be anyway. So it opens up the can of worms that we'll probably need to save for next week. But we were going to talk next week, I know, about Easter and Passover and the idea of the redemption and the Messiah. So
yeah, I think I have a question for everyone. If no one has another question right now, what are some of the meaningful things that you've done around it, either around a funeral service or in a time of grief, that you said this really worked a lot for me. This was really meaningful for me. It's partly a selfish question because Aaron and I, when we meet with you in times of grief, we want to be able to offer the best that we can. We want to do the best. So when we hear from you now, they're like, that really worked. And we're going to write it down and say, make sure to do this again. But actually, I really want to, I think it's good to hear from each other. Like, this is a way that in a time of grief, this really spoke to me. So if you're willing to share, again, just raise your hand and share, what are some of the things that you either did or that happened around a death, loss, funeral that was really meaningful for you?
Well, I'll pick it up. This is Ken Philmus. The one thing that I don't think Aaron mentioned, one thing that always has meaning for me is actually at the burial itself. Is tradition, the Jewish, yeah, of course. The Jewish tradition is that the family or people who attend the funeral at least take one shovelful of dirt and put it over the casket so that you could hear at least as I interpret it, you can hear the thud as it hits the casket, and you say, okay, now it's real. The person has really passed. And that always has tremendous meaning for them. And I can remember a story where I went to a funeral for an elderly relative, and there was only 2 of us that filled in the entire grave because that was the Orthodox tradition. The conservative and Reformed tradition are certainly not as stringent. But it really has a lot of meaning to hear that thud always has some meaning. So that's one piece that always means something.
Beautiful.
Thank you for adding that. I forgot to mention that, but that's part of honoring the deceased person and so in conservative, at least I know we at least try to cover the casket so you can't see it. But in Orthodox traditions, yeah, instead of having the staff do it, they'll have the people there do the full burial, which takes quite a while, and it's very physical, but it's a cathartic way to do something physically while you're dealing with this.
The other thing, if I could quickly also add, is, Pastor, you mentioned Shiva. One of the things, traditions at Shiva, is that the mourners sit below everybody else. They sit on, not on a chair, but either on a stool or a wooden box or whatever it might be, but it's meant to be lower than everybody else. I think that's the way it is, Aaron, so maybe you could expound on that a little bit.
It's in the same way that they're not shaving, they're not buying new clothes, they're not looking in the mirrors are covered. They're in a humble place, and they're expressing that through their actions to the people around them, and also they're trying to comfort the soul of the deceased. This sounds kind of silly, but they're sitting on the ground or near the ground to say, I'm still here with you, I'm close to you, because that's where the person's body is. Not literally right there, but a kind of you're empathizing with them, and I'm there with you kind of thing.
Anyone else like to share? Barbara, you have to unmute your button. You have to press the microphone. Uh-oh, we still can't hear you.
Oh, you have to still unmute.
No, we still can't hear you, Barbara. I'm sorry.
I did push ask to unmute.
Yeah, I did as
Barbara,
well.
if you go to the left corner of your screen, there's a microphone with a red cross on it. Left bottom corner. There's a microphone with a slash on it. It's red. Just touch that.
Okay.
There you go.
There you go.
Yep. Excellent.
Okay.
Good.
My question might be a little bit more simple than what you're asking. What would you do? What do you do when you're in the presence of someone who is passing? How do you comfort them? I've had experience with this with a couple of people, and I like to think that it has helped them, but it has also helped me thinking, knowing that I'm comforting them. One being my husband, and another one was Ruth Silverman, which who you may or may not know. And I could tell you of that experience, but I want to have your experience. What do you do with the person who is passing?
Aaron, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, so I mean, there's definitely rituals like confession, which try to help the person get to a place where, you know, they're saying, I'm accepting that even that says like that if I die, which won't necessarily happen, but if I do, then it should atone for anything I've done, and I forgive people. And there's like kind of those things in the Shema and rituals. But of course, that doesn't always, you know, everyone is scared of that. And so I think just being with the person, accompanying them, and supporting their family that are there to help them to have strength to be with them. I also sometimes chant prayers that are from the rituals of the death rituals, and I even bring my guitar sometimes, but I like to sing some of the prayers about angels. There's a prayer specifically about the archangels that are surrounding you and the divine feminine presence that's above you. So they feel a sense of being surrounded. And then tell them also that story of the soul. Sometimes I do that if they want to hear like, well, what do we think about it? But it's hard. It's a difficult to help them to let go. It's not an easy thing for any of us.
I'm going to answer really quick because I see Susan has her hand up as well, and I want to get to her. But very similar. Depending on what stage in the active dying process they might be, because sometimes they're a little more lucid than not. So if you can talk and listen, I think that's good. But otherwise, I remind them that God is present with them. They're not alone. The 23rd Psalm is always a beautiful psalm that can, or praying with them, sometimes singing, depending if that was a part of the person's life, or the family all gathering and praying together. But just, praying that God, continue to be with them and they're aware of God's presence. I think that I've seen, that those are all good things to do. I don't know if it's Susan or Sue, but Susan, you have your hand up?
Yeah, when my late husband was on his deathbed, it happened to be in the season of Passover and Easter. And the doctor took me outside and said, this is the end. And my response, because I didn't want to hear that, was, well, this is a time of miracles. So who knows, right? But he was lying on his deathbed. He loved basketball, and they had basketball up on the screen, and his eyes were going back and forth and back and forth. And at that point, I said to him, it's certainly not what I want, but if it's time for you to go, it's okay to go.
Yeah.
And it seemed like giving that permission was what he was waiting for, because at that point he passed. So that was not so good for me, but it was, I think, helpful for him.
It's so hard for us to let go. Now, thank you for sharing that. That's beautiful. And to tell someone it's okay, I'll be okay, or you can go. I mean, you're tearing a part of yourself out.
Right.
That's
true. Yeah.
But what an act of mercy that was for you as well.
Yeah.
That's part of what I hear in that, the real act of mercy, and how beautiful that was. Thank you.
Thank you.
I think we're about at time, a little bit past, but we've always started a little bit late because Aaron and I like to talk.
Jonathan,
yes, go ahead, Jim.
Just a comment. I really like the fact that Aaron brings his guitar at a time like that. I think you need to dust off your bassoon.
That would definitely wake them up if they were
they
in
would.
coma.
I'll say there are appropriate times and inappropriate times for the bassoon. and I'll leave it. And part of my calling is to discern when are those inappropriate times to bring in the bassoon. Well, I want to thank you all for your questions and your thoughts and comments, and for being here. We'll have one more session next week, which Aaron, you said is Passover, Easter, and everything that
the Messiah, redemption.
Right.
Yeah.
So everything we haven't covered that has to do with Judaism and Christianity, we're going to cover next week. I think that's kind of what we're saying, right?
Absolutely. You're all set. You can convert even if you want after this class.
Thank you to both of you. That was a very inspiring session.
Thank you.
Good.
Thank you for sharing that piece of wisdom from your own life that you gave to us. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
I'd like to thank you also so much.
Oh, thank you. Thank
I go
you
to a
all.
Messianic synagogue,
Huh.
Oh,
so we
wonderful.
follow the Jewish traditions, but
There you
we
go.
believe in Jesus. It's beautiful, and we do mostly the Jewish holidays. We don't.
Thank you.
And it's wonderful because we have a lot of families where one person is, the husband or the wife is Jewish and
Mm.
the other partner is Christian, and it's such a wonderful fit for them.
Mm.
Well, it's nice to
to-
have a diversity here because I thought it was
Yeah.
just Baptists and, sort of standard Jews, but here we have a Messianic Jew. So there you go. We've got a good collection of different.
But this is beautiful.
perspectives.
This is absolutely beautiful.
Well, thank you. I hope to see you here
Welcome.
next week.
Oh, I hope to be
Yeah.
here. Thank
Yeah.
you.
Yeah. Thanks a lot, guys. It's
All
really
right, you're
Thank
welcome.
you.
Everyone enjoy the rest of the day.
Thank you.
Yes.
Have a good week.
Bye.
Bye.